Kick-ass facts, pew 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 pew! We're gonna talk about some shady shit, like supremely unethical actions that led to major advancements. Does the end justify the means? I don't know, but shit's about to get dark, so all the trigger warnings. Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman whose cancer cells were taken without her consent in 1951. They did, however, lead to significant medical breakthroughs. Lacks cells, known as HeLa cells or HeLa cells, were the first human cells to be successfully cultured and have been used in countless medical research studies, including the development of the polio vaccine, cancer research, in vitro fertilization, and AIDS treatment. The ethical implications, however, of using her cells without her consent were largely ignored at the time, and her family received no recognition or compensation for decades. Her family played a significant role in advocating for ethical standards in medical research, particularly concerning consent and compensation, and the rights of patients and their families. The story was hidden from the public, and her contribution wasn't acknowledged until the 1970s. In recent years, her contributions to science have been widely recognized, and she is now honored for her unintentional yet profound impact on medicine. I'm easing you in. It's gonna get worse. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It ran from 1932 to 1972. The U.S. Public Health Service conducted a study on the progression of untreated syphilis. The study initially involved 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without. Their informed consent was not collected. Researchers told the men they were being treated for bad blood, which was a local term used to describe several ailments such as syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. In exchange for taking part of the study, the men received free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. However, they were denied treatment. The study began in 1932, and by 1943, penicillin was the preferred treatment for syphilis, and the men were not offered treatment. The unethical study lasted for 40 years, but the knowledge gained influenced the development of modern bioethics, including the formation of institutional review boards and laws about informed consent in medical research. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the study participants and their families, resulting in a $10 million out-of-court settlement in 1974, and on May 16, 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal presidential apology. Turns out syphilis was a pretty big deal in the 40s. The Guatemala syphilis experiments from 1946 to 1948, the U.S. government and Guatemalan officials conducted experiments in which hundreds of Guatemalan citizens were intentionally infected with syphilis and other STIs without their consent. The goal of the experiments was to study whether penicillin, which had recently been discovered, could prevent or cure syphilis and other STIs. The researchers were particularly interested in how the drug worked at different stages of the disease and whether it could be used as a preventative measure. Researchers infected over 1,300 Guatemalan men and women with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. The subjects included vulnerable populations such as prisoners, mental health patients, soldiers, and sex workers. In some cases, sex workers who were already infected with syphilis were used to infect prisoners and soldiers. Once infected, subjects were monitored and treated with penicillin to study the effects of treatment. However, not all infected individuals received adequate treatment. None of the participants gave conformed consent. They were not aware of the nature of the experiments, and many were subjected to procedures without any understanding of what was being done to them. This also led to an apology from the U.S. government decades later, but the unethical research expanded scientific understanding of STIs, contributing to the development of antibiotics and treatment regimes. And finally, not finally forever, just finally for this list, the schmutzy medical experiments of the 1930s and 40s. During World War II, doctors performed brutal and inhumane experiments in concentration camp prisoners without their consent, often resulting in permanent injury or death. The experiments were a horrifying violation of human rights. However, the data gathered contributed to advancements in many fields. For example, hypothermia. The experiments influenced protocols used in emergency medicine, particularly for treating victims of cold exposure. Aviation medicine. The findings help improve safety measures for pilots and aviators exposed to high altitudes, which informed the development of high-altitude flight gear and pressurized aircraft. Prisoners were also used to test various pharmaceutical drugs for different conditions, including tuberculosis, typhus, and malaria. The prisoners were intentionally infected with these diseases and then subjected to experimental treatments. Some of these experiments advanced knowledge about infectious diseases and drug treatments, particularly in the realm of antibiotics and vaccines. Many scientists argue against using the data derived from the experiments due to the horrific conditions under which they were obtained. Others maintain that since suffering cannot be undone, any useful knowledge should be applied for the greater good so their suffering wasn't in vain. The Nuremberg Code is a set of ethical guidelines for conducting human experiments developed after World War II in response to the atrocities committed during the medical experiments. It was one of the first major documents to establish standards for ethical medical research on human subjects. The code is formulated during the Nuremberg Military Tribunal, specifically during the doctors' trials 1946 to 1947, where physicians were prosecuted for their inhumane and unethical medical experiments.